As of the release of this video, I will have surpassed 5,000 subscribers. To celebrate this, the music you are now hearing is entirely original and made by my good friend Dilan Shu. A link to his channel and his Spotify can be found in the description. Imperialism is a divisive subject. Some on the left claim national struggles against this force are anti-Marxist and have nothing to do with socialism, while the opposite side bases their anti-imperialism in post-colonialist abstractions. Both are wrong. After the Cold War, the West, along with capital, no longer burdened with the Soviet International, had seemingly won the power of the entire world. Some stating our stage of capitalism, which embraces parliament and an open global market, is the final stage of history. As capitalism in the 19th century had pitilessly torn asunder the traditional family, the ecclesiastical community, the fiefdoms, and the guilds, capitalism as a global order had done the same to the traditional view of international law, the old empires, their wars for dominance, and the Soviet International. In the place of the old European empires, in which capitalism had been born and had spread, capitalism itself has assumed the position of the global power. Instead of a local imperial power, there is an economic union, and where there was an imperial colony, there is a puppet government. Now the world is only divided by those nations which embrace global capital, along with its global bourgeoisie and free trade, the rogue states, and those in between. As Lenin had said that imperialist capitalism was itself the highest stage of capitalism, capitalist imperialism is the highest stage of imperialism. Capitalism as it had begun was a progressive force for civilization. It had brought industry. It had demolished the feudal order in Europe. It increasingly absorbed every nation in the world into its mode of production, by effect spreading Enlightenment values and planting the seeds for socialism across the world. On the contrary, capitalist imperialism is a stagnating and regressive force for civilization. It breeds slum poverty, empowers reactionaries, has made the developing nations into single-crop economies, and turned the Middle East into an oil fief. It follows that for the total victory of socialism and the European Enlightenment values of which it is based on, the East and the South must resist the capitalist imperialism conducted by the West and the North.
Francis Fukuyama caused a stir 3 years ago in a book called The End of History. He argued that democratic capitalism is the ultimate political system and the winner of a historical conflict of ideologies. Now, in a new book called Trust, he argues that social capital will become the chief determinant in a nation's struggle for economic success.
On the left, we have a very diverse, festering cesspool of stances towards anti-imperialism and counter to. An obvious outlier are the post-colonialists, or also known as the decolonialists, radical indigenists, Faninists, and worst among them, the Zachaists. Muke and his clique, who fit into the former camp of contra-anti-imperialists, tend to attach these leanings to any who declares themselves as anti-imperialist. This is an obvious straw man, but besides the fact that they are a small fringe group, they still do exist and are a vocal minority in online communities. Another similar, but in honesty, a distinct camp are the Third Worldists. While they spew a similar rhetoric to the post-colonialists, it is masked in Marxist language and absent of the identity politics. The humanist, left-communist position that has become to describe the Mukists, for the lack of a better word, are, despite a tiny minority, at large against the interventionism which makes up the appearance of imperialism. However, it is only in the name of abstract humanist ideals, and to use de Leon's ship example, not built on a solid materialist base, yet sailed by these ideals. This superficial anti-interventionism makes them susceptible, and as of late, currently active in imperial rhetoric and apologia. Of these three intellectual abortions, we will start with the post-colonialists, as they are the easiest of the three to dispel. Next, the third worldists, which requires much more meat, and finishing with the mucists, who are certainly not the most difficult, but are for certain the most entertaining. The post-colonialist anti-imperialism is starved of any economic basis. Rather, it commands a vulgar view of geopolitics, viewing it as a struggle between the settlers and the colonized indigenous races, clouded in tribalism and mysticism. Not only is this view entirely false, it's clearly reactionary and anti-Marxist. The legacy of European settlement in the Americas is one of brutality, yes, but so is the entire course of civilization. However, without a doubt, it was necessary for progress. It was integral for the development of capitalism. Marx even said so in the first few pages of the Manifesto of the Communist League in 1848. Therefore, to be against and to want to reverse this historical force is the same as wanting to reverse public education, the Industrial Revolution, or the Agricultural Revolution. In other words, it is not revolution, it is reaction. Reactionary ethno-nationalism disguised in leftist language, in the very same sense as primitivism or the very esoteric left NRX. Not only this, but the settler view has no relevance today that it could have had in the 19th and 18th centuries. The old empires, with only small resistance from the Eastern Bloc, had relinquished their colonies in the mid-20th century. As with the new course of financial globalization, to have a colonial empire was outdated and inconvenient. Regarding the Israel issue, the biggest mistake on the left is to label it as settler colonialism. There were no Israeli pilgrims or Israeli fur traders. Instead, there were only armed battalions of Irgun who would massacre villages and steal what was before part of the Arab civilization. Israel isn't a colony, it is a parasite, an outpost of finance capital. Its military to serve as muscle in its international profiteering against competing interests. Its main targets being Arab socialism and secular nationalism, which stood in opposition to oil rentier comprador bourgeoisie. Settler colonialism was a much more intricate development than just the rape, pillaging, and slaughter that occurred, which it shares with Israeli occupation. Settler colonialism was predicated on an entirely different economic development, namely the exploitation of the primitive world for the establishment of intricate trade in commodities such as fur, spices, gold, salt, cotton, labor power in the form of slaves, and later oil, in the name of profit all the same, but namely on the road to industrial development, whereas in the case of Israel, following the intricate structure of finance capital, development and underdevelopment means all the same. Before anyone misrepresents me as to saying that the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century were reactionary, quite the contrary. Not only were they of great emancipatory value, but also necessary to bring us to the current struggle, that is, of all nations against capitalist imperialism and then the bourgeoisie itself. I also support Lenin's self-determination of oppressed nations as a general principle. In regards to Canada, I also support the establishment of Aboriginal autonomous communes if they so desire.
I have crippling depression.
Third worldism is a jumbled ideology with many different tendencies. However, for this video I am only focusing on the brand of third worldism espoused by Jason Unruh, as it is the closest to a Marxist analysis of imperialism, while the others tend to belong in the post-colonialist camp. The basic analysis of imperialism in third worldism goes like this. The advanced capitalist countries exploit the developing world through moving production into the underdeveloped world. Commodities produced in the underdeveloping countries are sold at a cheap price in the Western mall economies. From the super profits gained from this unequal exchange, Western capitalists can afford to provide higher wages to Western workers. Because of this dynamic, the Western working class benefits from the exploitation of the underdeveloped world, and therefore does not belong to the global proletariat, rather is part of the global labor aristocracy. The problem with this is that it relies on the theory of unequal exchange, which is a regressive move from Marx into the medieval theory of a fair price, when Marx had tried to explain that profit is exploited in the production process, not in the exchange process. Secondly, there is no adequate explanation for the underdevelopment of the third world. As in the case of unfair exchange, there would be an interest for further mechanization to extract more profit. In Chapter 6 of Value, Price, and Profit, we see the true cause for the unequal exchange. It might seem that the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor bestowed upon its production. The lazier a man, or the clumsier a man, the more valuable his commodity, because the greater the time of labor required for finishing the commodity. This, however, would be a sad mistake. You will recollect that I used the word social labor, and many points are involved in this qualification of social, in saying that the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor worked up or crystallized in it. We mean the quantity of labor necessary for its production in a given state of society, under certain social average conditions of production, with a given social average intensity, and average skill of the labor employed. When, in England, the power loom came to compete with the hand loom, only half the former time of labor was wanted to convert a given amount of yarn into a yard of cotton or cloth. The poor hand loom weaver now worked 17 or 18 hours daily, instead of the 9 or 10 hours she had worked before. Still, the product of 20 hours of his labor represented now only 10 hours of social labor, or 10 hours of labor socially necessary for the conversion of a certain amount of yarn into textile stuffs. His product of 20 hours had, therefore, no more value than his former product of 10 hours. From this, we understand that the reason for an unequal exchange and trade is the difference of the quantity of labor within a commodity against the social labor, caused by a divergence in mechanization of production. This also explains the higher wages in the West, which Unruh attributes to the development of neo-imperialism. Using Occam's razor, I believe we can determine that the true cause is further mechanization of production in the digital era. Furthermore, from this we also have an explanation for underdevelopment of the third world, as there is an interest for a large reserve of cheap sweatshop labor from which to extract profit from. For more explanation on the topic of underdevelopment of the third world, we can turn to Anwar Shaikh's Foreign Trade and the Law of Value, written for the Marxist journal Science and Society, particularly Part 1 under the 4th section. The assumption concerning consumers eliminates differences in demand between two regions, say the developed capitalist world and the third world, as an explanation of relative cost differences. But even more important, the assumption of identical production facilities eliminates underdevelopment itself, and with it the problem of absolute advantages and disadvantages, as an explanation of relative cost differences, and hence as an explanation of the patterns of trade. The only thing that remains are the differences between national endowments of capital and labor. Here it is argued that regions which are relatively capital abundant, i.e. which have a relatively higher endowment of capital to labor, will be able to produce capital-intensive commodities relatively more cheaper than the labor-abundant regions. Conversely, the labor-abundant region would, of course, have a comparative cost advantage in the production of labor-intensive commodities. It follows, therefore, that the capital-abundant region, the developed capitalist world, will, and for reasons of efficiency and good of the world as a whole, should specialize in capital-intensive manufactured products, exporting them in return for the labor-intensive primary products of the labor-abundant, underdeveloped capitalist region. In other words, acceptance of and adaptation to through the existing differences between developed and underdeveloped capitalist regions is efficient from the point of view of the world as a whole. In summary, we do see global exploitation of the Third World, yes, and no doubt that there is underdevelopment. However, we must retract from the vulgar explanation of siphoning off resources and output through exploitation in exchange. The claim of the First World working class as global exploiters must also be dropped, since the dynamic presented by Third Worldists falls apart once we take away unequal exchange. Rather, the First World workers are also exploited through this dynamic as well, as previously well-paying union jobs had been shipped to the Third World, which decreases wages through the reserve army of the proletariat. However, this shift is offset by growing mechanization, which keeps wages higher than the rest of the world. Instead of a centralized relation where wealth is extracted from underdeveloped countries to the developed countries, we see a multipolar world arranged to the workings of global capital. The force of imperialism is conducted for the profit motive of keeping the Third World underdeveloped, moved by the workings of global competition, a topic which will be important in the next chapter.
Staring up across the room. I dare you play your cards, boy, you bet I'm a trendsetter too. Fire when the storm hits you.
Jew. Ooh.
Bet you're looking for something new.
Don't tread on me. Kill yourself. Mom's basement.
Staring up across the room.
Suck my dick.
Trigger.
Bet I'm a trendsetter too.
Yeah. Suck my dick.
Before getting into the final chapter, it's important to lay out some economic theory regarding market competition, how it transfers into a global sense, and is a force for imperialism, as laid out by Anwar Shaikh in part 2 of his book, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crisis. Real competition is the central regulating mechanism of capitalism. Competition within an industry forces individual producers to set prices with an eye on the market, just as it forces them to try to cut costs so that they can cut prices and expand market share. Cost cutting can take place through wage reduction, increases in the length or intensity of the working day, and through technical change. The latter becomes the central means over the long run. Real competition generates its own characteristic patterns. Prices set by different sellers are roughly equalized as each tries to gain an advantage over the other. Profit rates on new investments are also roughly equalized over somewhat longer periods. Both of these processes result in perpetual fluctuations around various moving centers of gravity. This is the classical notion of turbulent equilibration, very different from the conventional notion of equilibrium as a state of rest. Supply and demand are part of the story, but their roles are not decisive since both can change in response to profit opportunities. The notion of competition as a form of warfare has important implications. Tactics, strategy, and resulting prospects for growth are central concerns of the competitive firm. In turn, the relevant profit must be that which is defensible in the medium term, which is quite different from the notion of short-term maximum profit emphasized in neoclassical theory. In the battle of real competition, the mobility of capital is the movement from one terrain to the other. The development and adoption of technology is the arms race, and the struggle for profit growth and market share is the battle itself. Contrary to neoclassical beliefs, market competition as understood by Smith, Ricardo, and Marx is aggressive, where all methods to extract profit are on the table. Logically, it follows that this competition will also be carried out through nation-states. The contra-anti-imperialists, which includes Marxists such as Muke, as well as more moderate leftists such as David Sherratt, are outspokenly against anti-imperialism, the former denouncing it as anti-Marxist and even crypto-fascist, and the latter denouncing it as nothing but tanky support for dictators. Now, despite this, the two are openly against imperialism, however only to the extent which they understand it. As they understand it, imperialism is simply aggression towards a smaller state by a larger one, usually in the name of self-serving interests, but exists outside of the inner workings of capital. However, as I have previously laid out, not only is imperialism part of capital, but integral to its workings. Therefore, for a cohesive anti-capitalist position, a correct anti-imperialist line is required as well. Because of their infantile position on imperialism, it is better described as a simple anti-interventionist position, one that exists outside of their view of capital, not forming a cohesive analysis with it. Their opposition to intervention is only based on humanist ideals. On such a flimsy foundation, there is nothing stopping them from instead supporting intervention, or spouting apologia for it, or spewing the standard imperialist propaganda, which it too is based on the same humanist ideals. Where this is most apparent is on the issue of Syria, where both have been outspoken against those like myself who voiced critical support for Bashar al-Assad. While I explained this topic in my last video, in summary my critical support is predicated on realpolitik, that is, to support the national bourgeoisie against the comprador bourgeoisie, with the goal of industrialization away from the disastrous effects of free trade, which will inevitably lead to the socialist struggle. After all, the two industrial titans, the United Kingdom and the United States of America, had industrialized after a period of protection. The splendid isolation in the case of Britain, and the Lincoln and Grant era for the United States. Where Muke, as a Marx dogmatist, had said support for a class collaborationist nationalist responsible for war crimes as crypto-fascism, it sure would be unfortunate if Marx had held a similar position. Well, as it turns out, Marx had voiced support for a capitalist leader who suppressed freedom and was responsible for war crimes such as the pillaging of farms and destruction of cities. And like Assad, also the leader of a nation fighting a civil war. The leader in question being President Abraham Lincoln, whom Marx was a pen pal. Marx's support for Lincoln was grounded in much the same reasoning as mine, that is, to see the industrial capitalists whom favored protection prevail over the slave-owning aristocracy whom favored free trade, which would advance the social productive forces, creating the conditions for socialism. To further see how similar the issue of the American Civil War was to today's Syrian Civil War, I'll read an excerpt from Marx's article, The North American Civil War, dated in October of 1861. For months, the leading weekly and daily papers of the London press have been reiterating the same litany on the American Civil War. While they insult the free states of the North, they anxiously defend themselves against the suspicion of sympathizing with the slave states of the South. In fact, they continually write two articles. One article in which they attack the North, and another article in which they excuse their attacks on the North. The description of the 19th century English press is quite surreal in how relevant it is today relating to the mainstream media's coverage of the Syrian Civil War, and also the weak position held by the young lesbian David Chirat. Finally, the last point brought up against anti-imperialism by Muke is that national struggles have nothing to do with socialism. After all, if socialism is an internationalist ideology, how could nationalism forward the cause of socialism? Again, wouldn't it be a shame if Marx had argued for national struggle? If, on the other hand, the English army and police were to be withdrawn from Ireland tomorrow, you would at once have an agrarian revolution in Ireland. But the downfall of the English aristocracy in Ireland implies, and has a necessary consequence, its downfall in England, and this would provide the preliminary condition for the proletarian revolution in England. The destruction of the English landed aristocracy in Ireland is an infinitely easier operation than in England herself, because in Ireland, the land question has been up to now the exclusive form of the social question because it is a question of existence, of life and death, for the immense majority of the Irish people, and because it is at the same time inseparable from the national question, quite apart from the fact that the Irish character is more passionate and revolutionary than that of the English. Thank you to all 5,000 of you now for watching, and thank you to my friend Dilan Shu for making the music for this video. Make sure to follow me on Twitter and join my Discord. Links to everything will, as always, be found in the description. Dilan hasn't released the songs yet, but make sure to subscribe for when they do come out. For everyone I've ruthlessly criticized in this video, I implore you to make a response, possibly leading to a live debate. Good night, and good luck.
smack your bitch. Pull up over the stick. I'll make you bitch. Gonna shoot that bitch. Gonna kill that bitch. I'll make her snitch. Bitch will never snitch. Roll with the hoes. Smacking the hoes. Pull over the gravy. Make it roll crazy, ayy. Trippy niggas. Trippin' niggas gay. Hey, yeah. I got a new Glock. Yo, bitch, the mouth of my cock. She looking it good, just like a lollipop. Wanna open my wallet, all you see is green. When you look at my cup, all I drink is lean. Got a brand new whip, I'll smack your bitch. Pull up over the stick, I'll make you bitch. Gonna shoot that bitch, gonna kill that bitch. I'll make her snitch, bitch will never snitch.